Book 2, The Question. Chapter 14, Violin 6.1, August 16th, 79 AD. His love had bid him walk until there was naught but sand dunes in every direction for as far as the eye could see, and to stand and wait and to let the wind-blown sands overtake him until he become a dune all his own. So there he waited, and gradually as the years went by, the sand engulfed him. The sand itself made for bad company. No creatures made a home of him or came to visit him save for the occasional passing desert-dwelling survivor, none of which ever stayed long. It was lonely. The sand was scratchy and stung his eyes, and he did not like it one bit. Then finally, after centuries of being buried in his lonely sandy grave, the voice of his love rang in his ears like the bells of a cathedral, and Hemha emerged from his mighty dune, the dune that had been itself mightiest of them all, now a crumpled heap, a blemish on the otherwise pristine wind-swept landscape. It looked as though a gigantic bite had been taken out of the middle of the desert, with massive footprints trailing away from it. At least it did for a few weeks. The desert sands have a way of hiding the past, rivaled on earth only by the water, air, and fire, all themselves effective at concealing the truths of the past. It seemed that nature wanted things to be forgotten when their time was over. It seemed that once nature was done with something, it buried it of its own accord, given only a short time. Within a few months, Hemhut's dune looked just like all the others. No evidence of him ever having been there remained. The desert healed the wound he had made in its side, and then forgot about him entirely. The giant trekked through the desert night and day, forever in the direction of her voice. She was not far. They would be together soon. He would again, at least for a time, be not alone. People flocked to Pompeii in droves for its famous luxury amenities. Cafes, bathhouses, and spectacles of every kind suiting the lustful tourist abounded. It was a place where one could come to get whatever they should desire, provided it could be found between the legs of some sweet young thing or another, in the bloodshed of a gladiator across the amphitheater, or the prospect of any number of other private indulgences, and provided one could pay the cost for the services the city offered the traveler. Helen was young and pretty, and interested in sex, but she hadn't even had her first period yet, and her father explicitly forbade her from any kind of sexual activity without his express consent, and certainly would not let her fornicate with any man without demanding a dowry or marriage proposal. He was conservative-minded when it came to his daughter. It was just in his bones. When they had visited Pompeii together months earlier, she'd started to get even more new and exciting ideas about sex, given the nature of the city and its seductive artwork and advertisements. And she started talking about how maybe she could go there to meet a rich husband, and how maybe she might not be happy with just one man, certainly not the first she tries, and it seemed she had altogether become sexually liberated by their trip, not the intent of her father when he decided that it was safer for her to accompany him than stay behind without him. Her father, Marcus, was beginning to regret that he'd ever brought her along. Helen and her father lived in Herculaneum, a small city overlooking the Bay of Naples on the other side of the Black Mountain that overlooked both their home and neighboring Pompeii. Her father was a respectable conservative man. He wasn't ready yet to let go of the notion that she was his daughter and as of yet untouched. He wanted to keep her as his for as long as he could before giving her over to a husband or, God forbid, the roaming hands of the city. It was well known the fate of curious, pretty young girls who are left to wander in such a place of freedom. He loved Helen, his daughter. He didn't know that he would love Helen the whore in the same way, and he wasn't ready for his heart to break in such a way. So he forbade her for all the good it would do from anything that he described as a disgraceful act, and demanded that they not speak of the matter again. Marcus had a great job. He worked directly for the governor as part of the masonry crew who maintained the Aqua Augusta, the Roman aqueduct which provided fresh water not only to Herculaneum, but to many of the smaller surrounding villages. Helen lacked for nothing. As it was, for all that would be Violin, she lived a life of ease. All that was missing from her world, so far as she was concerned, was fornication. Then, suddenly, it wasn't missing from her world at all. Suddenly she was inundated with it, as she began to see through the eyes of so many, not only in Pompeii and Herculaneum, but throughout the empire and then beyond, some 3 and 4 at a time going at it, fornicating in all manner of ways. The product of the overly sexualized environment in which she was raised, in spite of her father's intentions to keep her pure, she suddenly found 1,000 dicks in her all at once, and she stayed there, and kept them inside, adding more and more as she came across them. She didn't look to the beyond with her gift. She looked only for any sex act she could find, focused strictly on them, and ignored everything else as well as she could. When she became cognitive enough to realize that she'd begun to gyrate in her seat in view of the servants, she went straight away to her room and latched the door shut. She came out 2 hours later and was right back in again less than 20 minutes later, again not to be seen for hours, not until she'd rubbed herself raw. Even as she supped across from her father that night, her mind was in so many pleasure seekers at the same time having their way with one another, and she had scarcely the wherewithal to concentrate well enough on her own environment to even eat her food. To her father, it appeared his daughter was lost in some entrancing daydream, the content of which she did not want to share. He had to repeat himself nearly every time he addressed her, and watched as she drifted off again after every brief interaction with him. She did not reveal to him her profound new gifts until the following day, when the smear of time became more legible to her, and she found it such a thrill to know the coming moments before they happened, such a thrill that she could not keep it to herself. She proved it to him easily as she did the validity of her claim to be able to see through the eyes of others, as there is so often little difficulty in proving something is true when it is true. Of course, she didn't tell her father how she'd been spending her time and using her gift. Her new favorite thing as of the morning of that second day was to use her newfound ability to stretch her experience of time and prolong the orgasms of those she watched. She had actually made herself bleed from having masturbated so much that day, but didn't let that stop her from doing it more, especially as the wetness of the blood momentarily heightened the sensation every time that she would cause herself to bleed. She was in her own little corner of heaven. Helen only once in a while would pay any attention to the screaming atrocities done to others by others, would only briefly take note of the laymen begrudging their duties, and only for moments be a child at play, and not a lover for pay. She chose to ignore the experience of anyone not currently indulging in the behavior she'd so longed to engage in herself, and had now done hundreds of times each, vicariously through the shared experiences of strangers over the past 2 days. She felt like a different person, like she was so herself experienced. She'd tried sex from every angle in every way with every kind of partner and group. She'd been a man as he came inside an anus, inside a vagina and a mouth, even inside another man. She'd been a woman undiscriminatingly allowing for the use of her every orifice by whosoever should approach. She'd done every drug and drank every drink, smoked all variety of herbs, and had loved every moment. Hemha and Lylin had never had a sexual relationship. It was not part of their love for one another, and though he knew that it was Helen and not Lylin herself that he was hearing incessantly pleasure herself to the rhythms of strangers alone in her room, he could not help but feel a little jealous. He was tempted to hasten his journey and enliven his step, but knew it was forbidden, so didn't. Above all, as Lylin says, he must not be seen. Deviating from Lylin's instructions could have dire consequences, so he begrudgingly stayed his pace and journeyed slowly toward her, listening to her every quickened breath and hushed moan of ecstasy along the way, anxious to awaken his sweet love and silence the sensual sounds coming from her vessel once and for all. Daniel Dwyer 12, August 8, 2043 AD. Jacob Littlejohn was gay, and he was proud of it. He wore his homosexuality on his sleeve, or, as was more often the case, his lack thereof. He was not the least bit ashamed to be who he was, and he lived as though things were as they should be, as though he ought to be able to live as he so chose, and seldom considered the consequences of being himself, unless they were right in his face, as they would be tonight. He was a good man, light of heart and quick to laugh, not one so deserving of hate as he was so hated, despised as he was so despised, and by someone who had only moments ago learned of his existence. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had just caught the attention of a stranger who not only didn't like him, but didn't like his kind in general. The only mistake Jacob made that night was pointing at the wrong person, using the wrong bar patron as the focal point to examine something profound that he felt he needed to explain to his friend. He could have pointed at any other random person at the bar, but he just happened to point at Roy. It was Jake and his girlfriend Tammy. They so often went out together and tried never to frequent any place, resolved to hit every single bar in town together at some point in their lives. They'd never been in Kathy's bar and tavern before, and it didn't look like a very hip spot, but Tammy had noticed it on her drive that day, and if patronizing it meant another check off their list, then that was where they were drinking next. So it stands to reason that some things are simply the consequence of fate and unavoidable. See, Roy Upton went to Kathy's every night, and if Jacob and Tammy were truly intent on eventually patronizing every bar in town, then the confrontation between Roy and Jacob at Kathy's may have been inevitable from the very beginning. Eventually they were bound to walk through that door only to find Roy Upton in his same seat drinking his same beer, be it fated to happen today, tomorrow, or further down the line. Some paths invariably cross, such is the way of destiny. They'd been chatting away at each other for a while in their usual playful banter. Then Tammy asked him an offhand question. "Why are you gay, Jake? You're good looking. You could get loads of girls. Have you ever thought of trying dating girls?" Jake looked around the bar and said, "How can I explain this to you, sweetie?" Then he pointed directly at Roy, a stranger across the bar from them, and he said, "Do you see that guy right there?" "Yeah," Tammy said, looking but trying not to look like she was looking, especially after she caught the stranger's eye. "Do you think he's attractive?" Jake asked as he lit a cigarette. "I don't know, I guess so," she said, shooting a second quick glance up at the large man. "Okay, well I don't," Jake said. "In fact, I think he's repulsive. I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. Now I ask you, why do you think it is that you find him attractive but I don't? We are, after all, looking at the same person." Roy couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could tell that they were talking about him, and he quietly steamed, trying his best to listen to what they were saying, growing angrier in his bar stool, offended by nothing more than the fact that words about him were coming out of the mouth of someone that he hated for no good reason. Perhaps it was that he had some latent homosexual impulses, and because he hated that part of himself, he acted aggressively to those who embraced what part of himself he shunned. Identifying the source of a feeling is perhaps the most subjective of all notions, even to oneself. Unwarranted feelings, most often the result of a failure in understanding, have been at the root of much misery in the time of man. Fear is the inescapable enemy. She stiffened in her chair, already getting an understanding for the point he was about to illustrate, and pondered what Jake had said for a moment. "I don't know." Jake waved an up-facing palm back and forth and said, "Well, there you go. People don't consciously decide what they find appealing or who they find attractive. I am not attracted to women any more than you are, my dear. It's not something that you decide. The decision of who someone is attracted to is made for them, not by them. So many gay people actually try to suppress this and force themselves to date members of the opposite sex despite never truly having the desire to, often because they are taught that it is what they are supposed to do. Many of them are taught that it is flat wrong to feel about another man or another woman the way that they naturally do. Thank goodness the world is starting to wake up now, and more gay people are coming out who can now safely feel comfortable being who they are, a luxury previous generations didn't have. It wasn't long ago that mothers lost their children for coming out and fathers lost their jobs. The youth were bullied into hiding or suicide by their peers. Now at least the world is coming around. I can't imagine having to grow up in a world where I would be persecuted for being who I am. Don't get me wrong, there is still a lot of prejudice against homosexuals going on today, but at least things are getting better. Tammy flagged the bartender over to get more drinks and said, "You're right, the world at large has become a lot more accepting, but there's still a lot of progress to be made." "Right," he said, "and it doesn't take a lot to set us back. That's why you have to come with me to vote next time, girl." The bartender arrived and brought them another round. Roy didn't drink very much and just sat nursing his beer, which was unusual for him. He wanted to keep his wits about him. He was going to make that faggot pay for whatever the fuck it was he'd said about him. He'd teach him to keep his name out of his fucking mouth, and maybe he'd put something else in it instead. Maybe after he knocks out all his teeth, he'd make him suck his cock. That's justice in the mind of the twisted and hateful. That was Roy's fantasy as he sat there trying not to stare. He settled up with the bartender, but waited a while longer before leaving the bar. Then he whistled on his way to his truck, got the bat out from under his seat, put a baseball cap on, got in, angled his rearview mirror to keep an eye on the entrance to the bar, and waited for his prey to come out into the open. He wasn't waiting long. He watched them hug farewell and then proceed to their respective vehicles. Then he got out of his truck, bat in hand, and said, "Hey!" as he walked with a macho bravado toward Jacob. Tammy hadn't made it to her car yet, and she reacted immediately, pulling out her cell phone and contacting the police. From the look of things, they had no chance at arriving in time. Jacob looked at Roy and froze. Roy was easily double his weight and had a good 5 inches on him, not to mention a freaking baseball bat in his hand. He couldn't believe that this was about to happen to him. "What were you saying about me in there, Roy said, as he rested the bat on his shoulder and approached the frightened man. "Leave him alone!" Tammy yelled, keeping her distance, phone to her ear. Roy didn't seem the least bit intimidated by the prospect of being arrested, apparent by the way he ignored Tammy and her highly vocal conversation as she alerted the police. Jacob didn't say anything. "Huh?" Roy said, using the bat as an extension of his arm to lightly shove one of Jacob's shoulders as if prodding him to respond as he circled around him. "What were you and your little girlfriend talking about, Nothing," Jacob said, clenching his fist in nervous tension. "I was just telling her how you can't choose who you are attracted to. We were just talking, that's all." "Oh, are you attracted to me, gay boy?" And he nudged him again with the end of the bat. "No," he said, "and we weren't talking about you. We were just talking, I swear." "Well," he made a tisk sound with his tongue. "See, now that's not the way it looked to me. I saw you point at me, and then I saw her look at me, and then I saw you guys talking and laughing, and I want to know what you were saying about me." "The police are coming!" Tammy yelled it, more so to again try and dissuade Roy from his actions than to inform her friend that help was coming, but he pretended like he didn't even hear her. When he'd finished encircling him, Roy stopped dead in front of him and started patting the bat in his hand. "So, what did you say about me?" "Nothing, I don't remember," Jacob said, backing away, only to find Roy keeping step with him. "Come on, tell me," he said. Then, with very angry undertones, he said, "What does a little-ass fucking faggot who knows nothing about me, what does he have to say about me, huh? You want to suck my dick or something, you fucking faggot? Is that it?" "No! Stop it!" Jacob started to cry as he backed up against the side of the car, and Roy stood uncomfortably close. "Leave me alone, please!" Roy stood there, feeling powerful, the little effeminate man trembling in front of his stone facade. Then he just decided that he'd waited long enough and he was going to do it. He was going to give this queer a new face. He wanted to be gone by the time the police showed up, so he just did it. He took a step back and very calmly said, "Well, how about you suck on this?" Neither Jacob nor Roy saw the spirit appear, but Tammy did, and just as the homophobe brought the bat back to gain momentum, she saw the spirit form from the void beside them and look into its black ball. It was dark out, but the form stood out against the darkness, a complete void of light where it stood, not simply dark, pitch black. When Tammy quietly said, "Oh my God," it wasn't in response to the fact that her friend was in danger, rather it was at the sight of the ghost. The first responder was still in her ear as she watched. It was all over in a veritable instant. The spirit grabbed hold of the blunt end of the bat in mid-swing, stopping it dead in its tracks mere inches from Jacob's left ear. Then, in a very fast and fluid motion, aided by the forward momentum that Roy's movements were providing, he, in a flash, took the bat from Roy's hands and shoved the handle of the bat into Roy's mouth until it burst out through the back of his skull, the bat more than halfway to its end buried in Roy's head before he realized that anything had happened at all. Jacob screamed and flinched as the force of the sudden impact to his assailant knocked the man off his feet and sent him to collapse a good 2 yards away from him, blood splattered from his ruptured skull falling still even as his body landed. Tammy kept her eyes on the spirit and watched it calmly consult its ball and disappear, quickly fading into the dark. It was over so quickly. The 911 responder, in response to the scream in the background and Tammy's sudden silence, asked if everything was all right. Tammy, a little hesitant, told them what had happened. "The spirit just saved my friend," she told them, still shocked by what had happened, amazement more prevalent in her voice than even relief. The responder asked if the perpetrator was still alive, having become accustomed to the outcome of purported incidents involving the spirit and the frequent need for body bags in their wake. "No," she said. "He has a bat through his head. My God, the spirit is real." Tammy went over to aid her still trembling and terrified friend as the sound of approaching sirens was heard in the distance. Her mind was reeling. She was a reasonable person. Yesterday she did not believe in the spirit, but now it seemed that she didn't have a choice but to believe in him. For reasonable people don't get to decide what they believe in any more so than they can decide what attracts them. They believe in what is real. Violin 6.2, August 24th, 79 AD. Her sight had evolved in the 8 days' time since its inception to give her more than 30 seconds of premonition, and Helen was enjoying herself thoroughly until that summer morning. There had been an earthquake, and she was distracted by her own world for the moment, helping the servants clean up all of her things that had been knocked about. She had seen it coming and warned her father. Their house stayed up, but their things were everywhere, many of them broken. Satisfied by a job well done, they sat to rest after they'd finished tidying up the house. On the advice of her father, she had refrained from telling anyone else about what she could do, but they had already seen her reaction in advance of the earthquake and began to whisper about her. Their suspicions were confirmed when they witnessed Helen announce that she foresaw that something worse was coming, and she took her father by the arm and led him outside and pointed at Mount Vesuvius just as a cloud of black smoke erupted from it, creating a great pluming spire that shot out high into the air before spreading out like water hitting the bottom of a pot. It had been only 2 hours since the earthquake, and the people of Herculaneum were still stirring from its effects when the incredible sound of the eruption shook their walls again like sustained thunder. People began to panic. It was fortunate for them that the wind carried the pumice cloud away from the skies above their town, for within hours of the eruption, in neighboring Pompeii, roofs were beginning to collapse from the weight of the accumulated ash and soot. The people of Pompeii wandered through a haze of ash and by nightfall could not even open their doors due to the heavy, ceaseless fall of ash from the sky. They could not see what the people of Herculaneum saw, the tower of smoke that continued to pump more and more darkness and death from the mountain's belly hour after hour. The furious mountain's wrath was not obscured from view in Herculaneum. Many of the townsmen were evacuating, and of those who had not already fled, many were huddled under the vaulted columns of the seaside sheds awaiting the return of the boat captains, many of which were murderously overcharging for fare to safety. The Roman guard eventually managed to quell the chaos, and an organized evacuation was soon underway for those who sought to leave. Helen's father, Marcus, took note of how the winds were carrying the cloud away from the town, and conveyed to Helen his false reassurances that everything would be all right. He had a responsibility to the town. If he and all of the other masons were to flee the city, the fresh water supply they relied on would surely suffer in short order. He had to stay to ensure that some order was maintained. Helen reluctantly consented, and as the hours passed, she watched as the people of Pompeii suffered through the relentless, ever-growing sea of ash that was blanketing their city on the other side of the mountain, and flinched as more and more structures collapsed under the weight. She wasn't happy about her father's decision to remain behind, but she trusted in his intelligence, and began to put her fears aside, and then it came. The pyroclastic flow that would put an end to Herculaneum. It was just about midnight, about 12 hours since the initial eruption, when the horrific flowing mound of death roared toward them, ripping down the countryside of the mountain and incinerating the countryside. The sound was terrifying, and as dark as the night was, even the trees that were incinerated in the path of the pyroclastic flow, the flames of which might have otherwise warned loudly of its approach, were so quickly themselves enveloped that their fire had only a chance to flicker briefly before disappearing, engulfed by the river of poisonous gases hurtling toward the city at 100 miles per hour, carrying a stream of pulverized rock and instantly incinerating everything that it touched with a wave of heat in excess of 1,000 degrees. The short-lived flaming burst along the rim of the approaching death wave, where it lit things aflame before swallowing them whole, made it look like a string of fireflies approaching in the distance. Hemhut set foot inside the city walls only 4 minutes ahead of the pyroclastic flow, and he was seen by many as he traversed the street, but he knew he needn't be concerned. Lylin had told him that many would see him, but that they would all be dead within minutes of having seen him, and not to stop walking until he'd reached her. The Romans of Herculaneum did not know what to make of the massive giant that walked through their town toward the mountain's height. Most met him with fear, but some even followed him, declaring that he must be Vulcan or any one of their many gods, and thought that he had come to save them. By the time he reached Helen, 30 seconds ahead of the superheated wall of gases, she thought that she was already dead. In her vision of the future, she was doomed to be eaten by the river of death the same as everyone else, until Hemhut appeared. Then she somehow knew that she was safe. Her father was astounded by the sight of the giant, and stopped running when his daughter also stopped, broke free of his hand, and approached it without fear, out of breath from running. He placed his fingers on her temples and said, "Hello, Lylin." "Hello, Hemhut," she said. Then Lylin hopped up into his arms as he stooped and said, "Shield me, Hemhut, keep me safe." Her little frame disappeared behind the mass of his forearms as he folded his arms around her, and he looked her father in the eye and nodded at him. Marcus could see the rim of the pyroclastic flow even in the dark of night, devastating the town and approaching fast. He nodded back at the giant, happy that at least his daughter, or what used to be his daughter, would be safe, and they held eye contact as the blast wave of heat and hell buried them. The heat was so intense that the discovered remains of Herculaneum citizens by future archaeologists would be found to have all of their hands curled into fists and feet curled into balls from having their flesh so rapidly cooked. Many of the bodies would be found with evidence that their heads had exploded from the rapid boiling of their brains and their skulls. Gaseous substances often take up several thousand times more space than they do when they are in their liquid and solid states. This is why steam power is so effective. It is also why human heads explode in 1500-degree heat. Being that he was not in hiding and directly in the open, as were the 20 or so fools that had followed Hemha as he walked, this was the unfortunate fate of Marcus, father of Helen, vessel of the sixth incarnation of Leyland. Instant death by way of his brain being flash-boiled. None that remained in or around the city of Herculaneum survived, none but Hemha and Leyland, and he carried her off, keeping her safely tucked away until they were miles from the devastation and it was safe for her to breathe without him having to clean the air for her. Then he unfolded his arms, and she climbed out. "Well," she said, finding her place on his shoulder as he walked. "That was close. Hello, my love."